February 23, 1945. Mount Suribachi, Iwo Jima. The volcanic dust hung in the air like drifting ash as Private First Class Tadashi Yamamoto crouched in a damp concrete bunker, his hands shaking as he wrote by faint lantern light. Every word he put on paper could have sentenced him to execution if discovered by his officers, yet he wrote them anyway because the truth had become too overwhelming to ignore. "The Marines are not human," he whispered to himself as he scribbled. "They do not die like other men. Everything we were told about American weakness was a lie." His heart hammered as he looked through the narrow firing slit. A moment earlier, he had witnessed something that defied everything he had been taught since the first day of training. 6 Marines had charged his position under machine gun fire so heavy that even veteran Japanese soldiers flinched. 3 fell instantly, bodies flipping backward in sprays of black sand, but the others pressed forward as if the gunfire only urged them on. When his comrades unleashed grenades in a desperate attempt to stop them, one Marine had thrown himself onto a grenade blast to shield his squad. Yamamoto watched in horror as that same Marine, bleeding from half a dozen wounds, pushed himself back to his feet and fired until his fingers could no longer grip the trigger. Within minutes, the position had fallen. The Marines advanced as if guided by something supernatural, something Yamamoto could neither understand nor reconcile with the propaganda he'd been fed. Across Iwo Jima, 21,000 Japanese defenders were buried in a labyrinth of tunnels carved through the mountain like veins. They had been promised they would face weak, soft American troops who feared pain, who feared death, who would break under pressure. Yet the reality unfolding in front of them contradicted every assumption of Japanese military doctrine. The math was writing itself not in strategy halls or war plans, but in blood and shattered stone. 26,000 Marines would be killed or wounded in just 36 days. But they kept coming. They always kept coming. The collapse of Japanese confidence didn't begin on Iwo Jima. It began years earlier. August 7, 1942. Guadalcanal. Corporal Hideo Takahashi, a veteran hardened in China where Japanese forces had swept aside entire armies, found himself confronting an enemy unlike any he had faced before. A week into the fighting, he wrote in his diary that the Americans who landed on Guadalcanal did not behave like the others. They did not retreat when surrounded, did not surrender when their situation became hopeless, and most disturbing of all, they fought at night. Something Japanese soldiers had been taught only they could do effectively. Darkness, once an ally, had suddenly betrayed them. When the 1st Marine Division, barely 16,000 strong, waded ashore, Japanese intelligence still clung to the belief that Americans were too soft to endure a long campaign. The Marines were labeled elite, yes, but elite in a civilian sense. Men trained in a democratic society, men who valued comfort, men who would bend under sustained pressure. Within days, those assumptions disintegrated. Lieutenant Shigeru Fukudome, commanding a reinforced company tasked with retaking Henderson Field on the night of August 20th, marched forward with confidence shaped by victories in China where his unit had overcome forces 3 times larger. But as his men advanced through the darkness, expecting panic ahead, the Marines waited with interlocking fields of fire laid out with engineering precision. Fukudome's company stepped into a killing ground so perfectly arranged that even his seasoned veterans did not comprehend what was happening until machine guns tore them apart. What shocked Fukudome most was what happened afterward. Marines didn't simply hold their ground. They counterattacked in the darkness with a ferocity that contradicted everything he believed about American behavior. His diary described them as moving through the jungle like ghosts, killing silently, then melting away before his soldiers could regroup. When he was killed 3 days later, only 90 men remained out of his 200. The Marines had lost just 12. Across Guadalcanal similar scenes unfolded. Japanese forces, confident in the power of their banzai charges, found Marines who did not break, even when stormed by hundreds of screaming attackers. Marines fought until physically overrun, then continued fighting with bayonets, knives, entrenching tools, and bare hands. Sergeant Kenji Matsumoto recalled seeing a Marine machine gunner continue firing with both legs shattered until Japanese troops physically killed him at arm's length. His assistant gunner instantly stepped into the position, firing without hesitation. 40 Japanese soldiers were lost trying to silence that single position. By late 1942, rumors about Marine training reached the Japanese mainland. Private Yamamoto, the same man now trapped on Iwo Jima, heard about them from an intelligence instructor who had interrogated captured Marines. The staff officer admitted that Marine boot camp resembled something more brutal than anything within a civilized army, describing 8 weeks of psychological and physical destruction designed to strip recruits of every civilian instinct, followed by a rebuilding phase that forged them into something else, something far more dangerous. The instructor compared it to Bushido twisted together with American industrial might. It was a combination Japan had never anticipated. Tarawa, 1943. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki commanded heavily fortified positions he believed would hold 10,000 Marines for at least a week. Instead, the 2nd Marine Division tore his defenses apart in just 76 hours. Private First Class Tadashi Ogawa, one of only 17 Japanese survivors, told interrogators that the first waves of Marines died by the hundreds, floating in the water, piling up on the beach. But the waves never stopped. A second wave died. More arrived. A third reached the seawall, flamethrowers roaring, and from that moment on, Ogawa said, the defenders realized they were facing an enemy who accepted slaughter as the cost of victory. Nearly 7,000 men died at Tarawa in just over 3 days. Marines who survived became symbols of relentless, unstoppable assault. By 1944, Japanese intelligence reports described Marines as shock troops who refused to retreat under any circumstance. Casualties did not degrade Marine combat effectiveness until units were nearly annihilated. Captured documents compared Marine tactics to a machine made of men, where riflemen, machine gunners, mortarmen, artillery, tanks, and aircraft moved in perfect coordination, directed not by high-ranking officers, but by junior leaders empowered to make rapid decisions on the battlefield. Paliliu demonstrated this terrifying speed. Lieutenant Colonel Kunio Nakagawa believed he had designed an impregnable defense, drawing on his experiences from earlier battles. His plan assumed American forces would pause after landing. Instead, the Marines advanced with such overwhelming momentum that by nightfall they controlled half the airfield. He wrote in his diary that his defensive plan collapsed because the Marines did not act rationally. They behaved like men immune to hesitation, immune to fear, immune to casualties. They acted with total commitment regardless of circumstances. Over and over, Japanese soldiers described witnessing Marine tactics that bordered on suicidal, yet always proved tactically sound. Sergeant Matsumoto, later captured on Bougainville, watched a 37-man platoon charge 3 machine gun bunkers head-on across open ground. 12 died. But in 4 minutes the Marines had destroyed all 3 bunkers. Matsumoto wrote that it wasn't courage, it was systematic use of acceptable casualties to achieve objectives before defenders could adapt. This willingness to lose men at a rate other armies could not tolerate created an impossible scenario for Japanese commanders. They could defend with too little force and lose positions, or concentrate forces and weaken other areas. Every option led to defeat. Only the timeline changed. Major Yoshi Takahori, who survived Iwo Jima, later explained that Marines absorbed over 20,000 casualties in 36 days, numbers that would have shattered any other army. But Marines simply reinforced and continued attacking without any visible loss of intensity. Japanese commanders, who believed inflicting 10,000 casualties would halt the American advance, watched those numbers occur in a single week without slowing the assault. Logistics amplified this imbalance. Japanese defenders fought from fixed positions with dwindling supplies. Marines fought from expanding beachheads with limitless resupply. Second Lieutenant Toshio Yamamoto, captured on Saipan, said he infiltrated Marine lines expecting to find exhausted troops starving for ammunition and food. Instead, he found men receiving hot meals, medical care, fresh water, and ammunition by truck in the middle of the night. Their supply dumps held more ammunition than his entire regiment. He realized then that Japan could never win. By 1944, Japanese High Command openly admitted Marines could not be stopped, only delayed. Captured documents instructed garrisons to fight to delay the Americans for as long as possible, acknowledging openly that defeat was inevitable. Japanese defenders fought not to win, but to make victory as costly as possible. Marines, by accepting those costs without breaking momentum, shattered even that grim strategy. On Tarawa, Private Ogawa said every defender understood the war was lost when Marines continued attacking despite catastrophic losses. An enemy willing to pay any price could not be defeated by making victory expensive. Survivors carried this knowledge to each new island. By Iwo Jima, every Japanese soldier knew they faced an enemy who would take the island no matter how many died in the attempt. General Kurabayashi, the brilliant commander of Iwo Jima, studied Marine tactics for months, building defenses explicitly designed to defeat them. He banned bonsai charges, built a honeycomb of tunnels, fortified every approach, and created kill zones that should have slaughtered any attacking force. And in the first hours, his defenses worked perfectly. Marines died by the hundreds on the beaches. Artillery rained down with terrifying accuracy. Entire companies vanished in minutes. Kurabayashi expected them to retreat temporarily, regroup, and then assault again. But the Marines did not retreat. They advanced into the storm of fire, crawling through volcanic sand, dragging wounded comrades, and identifying every crack in the Japanese lines. Flamethrower teams, demolition crews, riflemen, and machine gunners moved with murderous efficiency despite absorbing casualties that should have crushed morale. Private Yamamoto watched it unfold from his bunker, the same man who now scribbled in his diary in disbelief. He saw 3 flamethrower operators killed one after another, each replaced instantly by another Marine grabbing the weapon from a dying comrade. He saw demolition teams crawl forward even as entire squads were cut down. 30 bunkers fell in the first hour of combat. Yamamoto wondered how any army could sustain such losses and continue fighting. Almost none of the 21,000 Japanese defenders survived Iwo Jima. In contrast, Marine casualties totaled 26,000, numbers that would have ended the operations of any other fighting force. But the Marines kept advancing until the island fell. Kurabayashi's final assessment, smuggled to Tokyo, acknowledged the grim truth. He described Marines as the most effective fighting force he had ever encountered, citing their willingness to absorb casualties, overwhelming firepower, decentralization of command, and their single greatest advantage: they never stopped attacking. No defense could endure that. Across the Pacific, Japanese soldiers struggled not with defeat, but with understanding how Marines could fight with such relentless aggression. Corporal Takahashi, a survivor of 3 islands before his capture on Okinawa, explained that Army units attacked, took casualties, then pulled back to reorganize. Marines, however, attacked, took casualties, and attacked again, stepping over their own wounded without hesitation. This confused Japanese commanders because it defied all rational doctrine. The answer lay in Marine training. Captured documents and interrogation reports described a transformation unlike anything in the Japanese system. Boot camp destroyed the civilian mindset, then rebuilt men into Marines whose identity was inseparable from the Corps. Every Marine was taught that failure was a betrayal of every Marine who had ever fought or died before him. This forged a fighting mentality that baffled Japanese analysts. Banzai charges, once feared, failed catastrophically against Marines. On Saipan, Colonel Takuya Takashima led a final charge of 3,000 men, expecting to overrun the American lines. Marines counterattacked instantly, fighting hand-to-hand for hours. When dawn came, 3,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Marine casualties numbered only a few hundred. Survivors like Private Yoshida admitted they had believed Americans were cowards who relied on firepower because they feared close combat. This illusion shattered that night. Japanese propaganda collapsed under the weight of reality. The supposed softness of Americans proved false as Japanese soldiers watched Marines fight in sweltering heat, monsoon rain, and disease-ridden jungles with endurance that sometimes surpassed their own. Japanese forces starving on Guadalcanal saw Marines eat 3 full meals a day and receive endless resupply. Marine combined arms tactics further widened the gap. When Marines encountered a bunker, they used artillery, tanks, flamethrowers, naval gunfire, airstrikes, and demolition charges, coordinated within minutes by junior officers using radios Japan lacked. Lieutenant Fuku, before his death on Guadalcanal, wrote that Marines did not fight as individuals but as components of a massive, coordinated machine. Delays that plagued Japanese forces vanished because Marine systems were designed for speed, firepower, and efficiency. This was not a clash of warriors, but a collision between Japanese courage and American industrial power channeled through the Marines. Spirit alone could not overcome aircraft, battleships, tanks, flamethrowers, radios, and an unending supply of replacements. The war's outcome had been decided long before the first shots were fired. Only the cost remained variable. And the Marines, through training, doctrine, and culture, were prepared to pay that cost. From Guadalcanal to Tarawa, from Peleliu to Saipan, and finally on the black sands of Iwo Jima, Japanese soldiers encountered the same unbreakable truth. Marines did not stop. They endured losses, then advanced. They were wounded, then advanced. They were outnumbered, then advanced. They paid any price demanded of them. For Yamamoto and thousands like him, this unrelenting force broke something inside, something deeper than fear. It shattered the belief that Japan could win. By the end of Iwo Jima, every Japanese commander understood the mathematics of their defeat. They were fighting a nation that could replace every lost Marine, a nation whose industry dwarfed their own, and a fighting force that accepted death with the same calm certainty that Japanese soldiers believed only they possessed. An army that would pay any price simply could not be stopped. And so, in his bunker on Mount Suribachi, Yamamoto wrote words that would outlive him. Words that captured the despair of an entire army facing an enemy unlike any other. "They do not stop," he wrote. "They do not break. They are not what we were told they were. And now we understand. The war is already lost."